Thanks for tuning in. This is the summary of a book called The Knights of the Golden Circle. This presentation summarizes the book Knights of the Golden Circle by David King. It is on the conspiracy theory that ripped southern states out of the Union. Louisiana State University published the work. The author used over 20 historical societies for research. The bibliography is over 30 pages long, and the book is well researched and peer-reviewed. George Bickley founded the Knights of the Golden Circle on July 4, 1854, in Lexington, Kentucky. Bickley was born in 1823 in Virginia to a poor family and ran away at 12 years old. He grew up to practice medicine and the pseudoscience of phrenology in 1854. He married a wealthy widow in 1851. Those funds allowed him to start a westward expansion magazine. Westward expansion would be the passion of his life, and he believed that expansionism would be predicated on the preservation of slavery and Americanism. The idea of filibustering Central South America formed the nucleus of the KGC. Groups would raise funds to build private armies to invade Latin American countries. The most successful of these expeditions was William Walker's invasion and takeover of Nicaragua in 1855. That was under the Order of the Lone Star, which merged with the KGC in 1859. Most of the filibusters were pro-slavery and Southern expansionist. Mexico's War of Reform began in 1857. The liberals, led by Benito Juarez, were looking to reduce power of the church and financial elites. The KGC saw the political strife of Mexico as an opportunity to filibuster and take over four mineral-rich northern provinces: Nuevo Leon, Coahuila, Chihuahua, and Sonora. The KGC focused in the early years on Mexican filibuster and would transition later into secession. The Knights of the Golden Circle had three branches. The military arm, which was Knights of the Iron Fist, was the lowest one. The financial arm was the next highest. It was the Knights of the True Faith. And the last and most powerful branch was the Knights of the Columbian Star, which was the political arm. And that arm had political figures such as John Breckinridge, who ran for president in 1860 and was James Buchanan's vice president. These orders were very secretive, and members of lower orders might not even know those of the higher rankings. One misconception about slavery is that the government could contain it in the southern states without expansion. Slave populations grow exponentially, where farming agriculture expands geometrically. So in a generation, you would have twice as many slaves with maybe 40% more cotton yield. The disparity between population and labor demands meant that there would be a large number of idle slaves. So either slavery expands or there had to be some mass extermination of slaves. So the expansion into Latin America was crucial for the continuation of slavery. Mexico abolished slavery in 1829. Many Latin American countries abolished slavery before 1850. The South knew that they had to expand slavery to tropical climates in which large agricultural ventures were profitable. The North American West was rocky and not suited for plantations. On the other hand, Latin America was tropical. Therefore, you could have large-scale agricultural ventures there, and they would be profitable. That's why they wanted to expand southward. As stated earlier, George Bickley wanted to invade Mexico on behalf of the Juarez government. The goal was not to make Mexico the newest state. It was to build the Juarez government with American aid. To compensate, America would get mineral rights in northern Mexico. Bickley sold bonds in the KGC to facilitate this goal. In 1959, the KGC had around 8,000 soldiers nationwide ready to invade if war is needed. Most of these people were in Texas and Arkansas. However, many were on the East Coast in places like Virginia. The KGC was not the only group ready to take the northern Mexico. Sam Houston had an expeditionary force poised to attack the region. Buchanan also was willing to give federal aid to the Juarez government in exchange for transit rights in northern Mexico. He had to be careful about this because we had already signed treaties with Spain that we would intervene, and Spain backed the opposition government. Also, regional strife in the U.S. distracted from any goals in northern Mexico. Ultimately, Juarez was able to win the war without any intervention from the United States. Once the opportunity to intervene in Mexico had evaporated, domestic matters took precedent. The election of Abraham Lincoln, which the Knights referred to as a Black Republican, threatened slavery. The Democratic Party was split between the Northern Democrats that wanted to contain slavery and Southern Democrats that wanted to expand it all over the United States. They were headed by KGC John Breckinridge. To confuse matters worse, there was a third-party constitutionalist candidate, John Bell. The Knights had to focus on preventing Lincoln from winning so they can preserve slavery. If he wins, they would move on to secession from the Union. Had the U.S. grown southward, there would be a possibility of 25 new slave states, giving the balance of power to the South in perpetuity. The Knights still believed expanding Americanism to Latin America would be beneficial to all parties. Many in Latin America were working with the Knights as they had a counterpart organization in Mexico. Many Latinos believed Americans would, in fact, be better resource managers. Also, not paying miners because they were enslaved would increase profits. The Knights understood the moment to expand to Mexico had passed, but new opportunities were always on the horizon. Bickley understood that the Knights would need continued support from the South. Also, the Knights could aid in the preservation of the Southern way of life. In 1859, various KGC members accused George Bickley of fraud. He claims innocence, but agrees someone else should head the organization. Bickley had not been successful in gathering enough funds for the Mexican filibuster. To allow him to save face, the KGC gave him a nominal position in the political wing of the party. The real power then was transitioned to the state KGCs, which pledged allegiance to the government. So after this point, there were no more unified KGC. It was just state-run KGC. Bickley asked if the Knights would ever disobey the law of the United States, and he said that the Knights would never violate the Constitution. However, it was up to each soldier to decide what was constitutional. Lincoln won the election of 1860. Knights of the Golden Circle were instrumental in Confederate recruiting. The Knights made a splinter organization called the Minutemen. The Minutemen were a paramilitary group organized around the Revolutionary War, around Revolutionary War imagery. Initially, they conducted vigilante patrols to stop slave revolts. Many of these units became Confederate companies. By November of 1860, there were 8,000 Minutemen in South Carolina, but the organization also had branches in Atlanta and other southern cities. Breckinridge and Lane clubs originated to support their presidential candidate in 1860, but once they lost the election, the clubs converted to paramilitary organizations. Some of these Breckinridge and Lane clubs already had paramilitary wings that they formed after John Brown's raid in 1859. It was also essential not only to build a paramilitary, but to increase secession support in general. The Minutemen would hold torchlight parades in major cities to build support. I am so glad we no longer have to worry about such parades for white supremacy. John Floyd was a KGC member and Secretary of War under President Buchanan. Floyd was able to secure large sums of money from fellow Knight Henry Cobb, who was Secretary of Treasury. He used this money to procure ammunition to future Confederates. Floyd also ordered weapons be sent to Southern forts, even if the state had a strong secession movement. The Fire Eaters kept campaigning for many federal forts to be returned to the state, as the state gave them the original jurisdiction to have the forts. Floyd also gave many key commands to Southerners. North Carolinian Colonel William Loring was in charge of New Mexico. Kentuckian General Albert Sidney Johnson was in charge of Department of the Pacific. Georgian David Twiggs was in charge of the Department of Texas, which housed a third of the Army at the time. And P.T. Beauregard was Commandant at West Point. Buchanan found out that there was a plot to help the secessionists started by Floyd. He was afraid of backlash if he asked Floyd to resign, so he asked his cousin and Vice President John Breckinridge to do it. Floyd and Breckinridge discuss it. Floyd refuses to resign and keeps on working for another full week. Floyd at the end said he resigned because Buchanan didn't keep his promise to the South. The next year, at a banquet in Floyd's honor, he admits he plotted against the United States. In 1860, Winfield Scott was General-in-Chief of Washington, D.C., which essentially meant he was security for the capital. They got word from many sources, including Stephen Douglas, that the KGC had a plot to kidnap Buchanan and prevent President Lincoln's inauguration by stopping the Electoral College vote. Around 1,000 KGC lived in the DMV area, and reinforcements could be brought in from as far as Texas. Scott had reinforcements of his own, the largest detective agency owned by Allen Pinkerton. Pinkerton detectives were able to infiltrate the KGC to find the details. The plan was to first take over Baltimore to prevent reinforcements from arriving. There were separate plots to blow up the Baltimore train station and the custom house. There was a congressional hearing on this plot to overthrow the government. Many government officials, including congressmen, testified on what they saw and heard. The trial concluded that there was not enough proof of an armed insurrection. There was only proof that the KGC would attack the federal government if they felt the federal government impinged on states' rights. No one was jailed or punished as a result of this trial. John Floyd initially denied Scott more troops to protect Washington, D.C., but due to Floyd's resignation in December, Scott was able to increase armaments around the city. And by the time the electoral vote count happened on February 13, 1861, the Capitol was guarded by 7 regular Army troops and 24 pieces of artillery. Virginia's first vote for secession in February of 1861 failed 30 to 122. Those that opposed secession were often pro-slavery, but wanted to stay in the Union if they were allowed to keep their slaves. Former President John Tyler worked with Henry and Obadiah Wise to recruit secessionists. As secession numbers grew in militancy and number, many of the moderates moved over to secession. A mob formed to hang a principal supporter of the Union. The Knights formed various plots to take over Virginia. One involved kidnapping the governor and reconvening the legislature. If the Unionists held firm, the secessionists would arrest them. Another plot involved taking over various federal installations. The state legislature reconvened on April 17th. Henry Wise drew his pistol and took the floor. He announced secessionists had already taken over vital federal installations. The secessionists had not taken any of these installations yet. However, the thought they did get people to switch over, and the secession vote passed 88 to 55. Lies and intimidation took Virginia. Because Virginia succeeded, Confederate sentiment in Maryland increased. If Maryland succeeded, D.C. would then be surrounded by Confederate states, making it de facto part of the Confederacy. Lincoln ordered troops to be sent to Baltimore to protect against Confederate attacks. The National Volunteers, a KGC affiliate, came to stop this. Southern mob led by the National Volunteers came to stop them, and then the Southern supporters threw rocks and bottles at the Union soldiers. One of the soldiers fought back, and the police chief Kane came to break up the riot. But after it was over, he called for more informal militia to be sent. The mayor excused this behavior because he said it was caught in the moment. For days afterwards, a mob went and burned telegraph lines and bridges leading out of the city. The violence didn't stop till April 22nd when Lincoln agreed to reroute troops around Baltimore. General Ben Butler, on his own authority, came in at night and occupied Federal Hill, May 13, 1861. Union authorities arrest Police Chief Kane June 27th because he led many of those mobs. In Texas, 2 delegates from each Texas county first met to discuss secession January 8, 1861. Both Unionists and secessionists were able to make their case to the public. However, when Unionists spoke, secessionists would pat their pistols in intimidation. Before and after all these meetings, secessionists would hold torchlight parades to increase support for secession. One of these Unionists was beloved Texas Governor Sam Houston. He did not take a moral stance against slavery. However, he just thought the South would lose in a war against the North. Northerners are calm and calculating, and once their mind set to something, there's no changing it. Houston called for the state legislature to convene to stem the tide of secession. Houston's pleas were unanswered as the vote went 166 to 8. The only thing keeping Texas in the Union at this point was the popular referendum meant to be held March 4th. Now, Floyd appointee, General David Twiggs, was put in a precarious position. He was in charge of the Department of Texas, which largest installation was in San Antonio. Now, he could either fight back against the secessionists and shoot the people he was sworn to protect, or abandon his fort and be seen as a traitor. U.S. Marshal and Texas Ranger Ben McCullough gathered a volunteer unit of 500 people to make a move on San Antonio. They were supplemented by 4 KGC castles. When they get to San Antonio, they occupy rooftops and demand a surrender of the federal fort. After 6 hours of negotiation, David Twiggs surrenders his fort, and the Confederates escort him to the shore. The Confederates seized over $3 million in supplies. Kentucky was a one-party state split between Union Democrats and secessionist Democrats. Bickley was living in Kentucky at the time, and he wanted to push for a popular vote. He thought that a popular vote on secession, even if it lost, would inspire CSA Tennesseans to attack Kentucky. The governor was secretly supplying many secessionists and other militias that would support the Confederacy. The secessionists were running more intimidation campaigns against the Unionists. This time, Unionists didn't sit down for this. So Lincoln began to supply the Union Defense Committee of Frankfort, which was USA. There was also a measure to equally support Kentucky State Guard, which was CNA, and Kentucky Home Guard, which was USA. Again, the military broke up anti-Lincoln picnics and attempted to arrest John Breckinridge. On September 31st, 1861, the CSA attacked western Kentucky under Gideon Pillow. This prompted U.S. Grant to attack and secure Kentucky for the Union. The fighting in Kentucky lasted till late 1861, but the Union was able to secure Kentucky. George Bickley, the founder of the KGC, was arrested in 1860 for being a CSA collaborator. He was caught with KGC paraphernalia and opium. He served 2 years in jail. He died in Baltimore in 1867. The most famous KGC, Nathan Bedford Forrest, founded the KKK after the KGC dissolved. He kept much of the same structure and terminology as he learned from the KGC. One of the lessons learned from this story is capitulation to extremists doesn't work. The states where the Union waited and capitulated and compromised ended up going to CSA. The states where the Unionists took a strong militant stance stayed in the Union. Many of the arguments Bickley used to justify the Mexican invasion are still used to invade countries worldwide. The rhetoric of spreading freedom to mask expanding U.S. economic interests is still used. Also, that these economic interests are rooted in the exploitation of the weak. Many of the tactics of intimidation and inciting riots are still used today by modern militias such as the Proud Boys. I think the KGC could serve as a template for future actions of these groups. I think those on the left need to prepare. Overall, King's book is held as a brilliant scholarly work. However, there were a few critiques. Many historians wanted to make it clear that not all secessionists were expansionists. Many in the Deep South had no intention of expanding. King used membership numbers from prominent KGC members. These members had reason to inflate the numbers to make their organization look larger. Also, the chapters on Texas and VA didn't sufficiently prove the KGC was the chief driver in secession, only one in many players. Many of those who participated in these intimidation campaigns and filibustering just like to plunder and attack. All of them didn't have an expansionist agenda. They just liked to fight. Ultimately, all sources agreed that the KGC existed and had a hand in secession. The only disagreement was to what degree and if the KGC was the leading force. Many journal articles corroborated the facts from the attempted invasion of Mexico, and one source even put the KGC as a leading force in the Texas secession. Thank you for watching, and please donate.